Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be going over the cardiovascular system and the respiratory systems. So specifically, we are going to focus on the pathologies associated with these systems. So common disease states, disorders, but we're going to review some aspects of the anatomy and physiology first to consider the structural aspects and how these structures operate. And once we do that, we can look into what happens when there is a disordered state associated with any of these structures. So our learning objectives are to identify the major components of the cardiovascular system and also the respiratory system. Also looking at some of the physiology, so the function of blood vessels, and the heart in the cardiovascular, as well as respiratory structures such as the lungs, the structures that make up the airways. And then we're going to look at pathologies that are associated with each system. But there will be a focus and consideration of interpreting the medical terms that are related to these systems. Before we begin, I'm going to start with a review question based on our past unit. So your upcoming quiz, which will occur next week online, it is going to be open from Monday until Friday. I've extended it to open on Monday because there's a holiday next week, so just to account for that. But quiz 2 will have last week's material, so the integumentary system and the musculoskeletal system, as well as this week's content. So just a little recap refresher. This should just say checkpoint at the top, so don't mind that. But I'd like you to take a moment, pause the video, and break down the term osteomyelitis into its word parts. I'd like you to identify the meaning of each component part and provide a definition of the condition in your own words, as well as thinking about what part of the musculoskeletal system is primarily affected by this disorder. So I'd like you to take a moment to pause the video and do that. Okay, so let's take this question up together. Now, if we look at the word osteomyelitis and we start at the beginning, we see osteo and then myel. So we're seeing two unique components of this word, right? So the first one that we can identify is osteo. And there's the combining form there, osteo, with that combining vowel O. This is referring to bone. If we look here, we can see, myel. This is a root that means marrow. So marrow referring to the soft and fatty tissue that's found inside of bones. And finally, that leaves us with the suffix itis, which we've seen many times, which means inflammation. Based on this breakdown, if we even forgot the less common root myel, we see osteo and we see itis, which we've looked at a lot in the past. So we know that we're dealing with inflammation of bone, and the myel is bone marrow. So this specific disorder, as we talked about last week, is a medical condition that has inflammation or swelling of the bone, typically caused by an infection. So it's usually caused by Staphylococcus aureus bacteria, and it affects the bones, specifically the long bones of the arms and legs, and reaches the bone marrow, which is found deep inside of the bones. And so when the infection reaches the bone, it causes the bone marrow to swell. So a little breakdown or a little review, I guess, of one of the components that we discussed last week. But now let's kick off the cardiovascular system. So let's begin with a foundational concept. The cardiovascular system is a closed system. Now, when I go over these systems, again, I'm going to be discussing some of their anatomy and physiology, for the purpose of how it relates to the pathologies that we're going to talk about in this lecture. So a closed system means that blood remains contained within the continuous network of structures that make up the cardiovascular system. That includes the heart and associated blood vessels. So the heart remains in this closed network. And under normal conditions, blood does not leave this system. If it does, such as during bleeding or hemorrhaging, this indicates a disruption of this system. So again, the cardiovascular system contains three major components: the heart, which serves as the muscular pump, the blood vessels, which serve as the pathways for blood to travel through, and the blood itself, which is the circulating fluid. So this continuous contained pathway is what defines the system as closed. Maintaining this closed system is really important for regulating blood pressure, which requires maintaining blood volume within the space of this closed system. And this also helps with ensuring that blood flow occurs in one direction within a given segment of the system, whether that's veins sending blood back to the heart or arteries that carry blood away from the heart. So before we begin, I'd like you to consider these questions. This might be something that you already know based on what you've talked about in other courses. There's also some terms here that we've seen in this course, but now we're going to be applying them more in context. So I'd just like you to consider these questions. I'm not going to take them up right away, but they will be answered as we move through this lecture. The first is, why do arteries have thick walls, but veins have thin walls? The second is, which ventricle has a thicker muscular wall and why? And the next is, what is ischemia? And what might occur, or what might happen, sorry for this typo here, but what might happen if this occurs in the heart? So let's start with blood vessels. Now, there are three main types of blood vessels. This includes arteries, capillaries, and veins. Each structure is specialized for its role in circulation. So we'll start with arteries here. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Think artery away. They both start with A. Because blood is leaving the heart under relatively high pressure, since the heart is a muscular pump that sends blood out into circulation under relatively high pressure, arteries therefore have thick and strong walls. They need to be able to withstand the pressure that is generated when the left ventricle contracts and sends that blood out of the heart and into the arterial system. So the arteries can withstand that higher pressure because they have thick, strong muscular walls. Specifically, the middle layer that makes up an artery, which contains muscle and elastic tissue, is much thicker in an artery than it is in a vein. The lumen, or the inner space of these vessels, is typically smaller and more round in an artery compared to a vein, because these arteries have a thicker muscular layer here. So once blood is pumped out of the heart, it's pumped under higher pressure, moves through the arteries, which are quite thick, or thick-walled, I should say, and then that blood gets carried through an arteriole, which is a smaller branch off of an artery, and into capillaries. So capillaries are the smallest blood vessels, and they are the sites where gas exchange occurs between the blood and body's tissues. Their structure is very different from arteries and veins. Capillaries have extremely thin walls made of just a single layer of endothelial cells, so they're one cell thick. This thin barrier allows oxygen, nutrients, carbon dioxide, and wastes to move between the blood and surrounding cells. So say this artery is traveling from the heart, the arteriole branches off into a section of my arm. This capillary bed here might be located within one of the muscles of my arm. In this area, oxygen from the blood that is being pumped through the artery, which is relatively high in oxygen since it just came from the heart, that blood is going to reach the capillary bed and the oxygen is going to be delivered to the muscle in that area. Also nutrients, so things like glucose that our muscle cells need to be able to perform metabolism. As the cells of the body and within our tissues metabolize energy, they produce wastes. So wastes including carbon dioxide, which is a direct product of cellular respiration. That carbon dioxide is going to move from the tissue and into the capillaries. So because of this specialized function, capillaries do not have that thick muscle layer like arteries. So now we move forward from the capillary to a venule. A venule is just a smaller portion of a vein, or a smaller branch that branches off of a vein. So the venule will be continuous with a vein. Now, veins will carry the blood back to the heart. The blood just dropped off its oxygen and nutrients and picked up carbon dioxide and wastes. So that is going to be brought back to the heart via the vein. So this blood is low in oxygen or deoxygenated blood. By the time blood reaches the veins, the pressure is now much lower than it was in the arteries. The pressure has lessened quite a bit as the distance from the heart has increased, or because we are now moving into the capillaries where gas exchange is happening. So a lot less pressure here in the capillaries to allow for the movement of substances to and from the blood. So now for veins, much lower pressure than in arteries, and as a result, veins have much thinner walls. Specifically, that middle layer represented in red, see how much thicker it is in the artery than it is in the vein. So veins have a much thinner, smooth muscle and elastic tissue layer compared to arteries. Veins also tend to have a larger lumen. Lumen is the open space within the vessel, and this helps to accommodate blood returning to the heart. Many veins, especially in our legs, contain valves. These valves help prevent blood from flowing backward. Veins are carrying blood often back up to the heart against gravity, especially the veins in the lower limbs and in the arms, as your arms tend to be down at your sides often. So veins contain valves that help prevent that blood from flowing backward and maintain blood flow back to the heart. So structurally, we can summarize the differences as arteries have thick walls, thicker smooth muscle and elastic tissue, a relatively smaller lumen, and operate under high pressure. Veins have thinner walls, a larger lumen, operate under lower pressure, and often contain valves. And then our capillaries are extremely thin-walled single-cell layer, really specialized for gas exchange. So now let's look at the heart. The primary function of blood is to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the body's cells and remove wastes from those cells, as we just talked about. So, in terms of location, the heart is located in the thoracic cavity between the two lungs in the space that is central within the chest called the mediastinum. So in order to deliver oxygenated blood to our tissues, the heart pumps blood from the right side of the heart, where blood is returned to the heart, into the right side, from the right atrium. The valve that separates the right atria and the right ventricle opens, called the tricuspid valve. After pressure sufficiently increases in the atrium contracts and sends blood into the right ventricle. This happens simultaneously, so the right atrium and the left atrium contract at the exact same time. So blood is sent from right atrium to right ventricle, and at the same time, blood is sent from left atrium to left ventricle. As the right ventricle contracts after sufficiently filling with blood, it pumps blood past the semilunar valve that is located here in the pulmonary trunk and through the pulmonary arteries. You have a left pulmonary artery that sends blood to the left lung and a right pulmonary artery that sends blood to the left lung. Now, once blood is sent to the lungs, this is where it will pick up oxygen, and it will also deliver the carbon dioxide That was waste from the body's tissues to the lungs, and we then exhale that carbon dioxide gas. After oxygen is picked up in the lungs, that blood returns to the heart into the left atrium through the left and right pulmonary veins. Once the left atrium sufficiently fills with blood, it contracts, sending blood over the mitral valve or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. Now, the left ventricle is actually a lot more muscular than the right ventricle. And the reason for that is the right ventricle is pumping blood to the lungs, which is a relatively shorter distance compared to the left ventricle, which is pumping blood through the very large aorta, the largest artery in the body, and out to the rest of the body, so the rest of the body's tissues. Therefore, the left ventricle needs to operate under much higher pressure and be able to contract very strongly to be able to send blood that greater distance. As a result, the left ventricle is a lot more muscular than the right. After blood is pumped through the left ventricle, again, it moves past we can see the aortic valve here, semilunar valve, that opens and sends blood through the aorta and out to the body's tissues. So as a recap of that pathway of blood, the superior and inferior vena cava deliver deoxygenated blood that contains wastes to the right atrium. The right atrium contracts and that blood is sent to the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts after sufficiently filling with blood as well and sends that blood out to the lungs. In the lungs, the blood picks up oxygen and also delivers waste in the form of carbon dioxide. That becomes the carbon dioxide that we exhale. And the blood is returned to the heart after going to the lungs via the left and right pulmonary veins. The left and right pulmonary veins deliver that blood to the left atrium. The left atrium contracts, sends that blood to the left ventricle. The left ventricle contracts, sends that blood through the aorta and to the rest of the body. So this is some anatomy and physiology of the heart itself. Now, this will become important when we start talking about what happens if one side of the heart fails or the pump on one side of the heart is not operating properly. What might be associated with this observation? And what would happen if the left side of the heart failed? So we'll see that on an upcoming slide when we look at pathologies. So as I mentioned, and it's kind of summarized on the last slide, this photo is a really great image that illustrates the circuitry of blood flow from the heart. So we can see how the right atrium and right ventricle here carry deoxygenated blood separated from the left side of the heart by the interventricular septum. Now, that heart will be pumped through the pulmonary circuit to the lungs. There are capillary beds of the lungs where gas exchange happens deep in the lungs. And blood returns to the heart to be pumped through the rest of the body. So this could represent a capillary bed at any area of the body. Capillary beds will be all throughout our body's tissues, and gas exchange occurs in our tissues. Oxygen is delivered to the tissues. Carbon dioxide, rich blood is then going to be transported back to the heart. And just a reminder of this great resource that's available on Brightspace called Zygote Body. If you click on, I believe this link might take you directly to the highlight on the cardiovascular system. But in this program, what you can do is basically eliminate tissue layers in the body to be able to visualize a certain system. So you can remove some of the skeleton here so that you can just see the heart and the associated major vessels. And you can click on or see the specific structures and the names of structures too. So just a little reminder if you're interested in reviewing some of the gross anatomies. And here we can see in this lovely GIF here, the heart contracting. And I like this because it really highlights how here's the right atrium, here is the left atrium, how they will contract at the same time to send blood into the ventricles. And we see the ventricles are also contracting at the same time. And we can see the opening of the valves there. So after the atria contracts, the valve opens to allow blood to flow into the ventricle. When the ventricle contracts, we see the semilunar valves opening. The aortic semilunar valve here, and it's kind of hidden, but the pulmonary semilunar valve would be sending the blood to the lungs. So, does anyone know the main role of the heart valves? So, the main role of these valves is to prevent blood from moving backwards. We want blood to be maintained in one direction, moving forward through the heart and the cardiovascular system. And the valves prevent the backflow of blood. They will actually snap shut, as we can see when they snap shut when the ventricle contracts, to prevent blood from flowing backward when the ventricle contracts. And same thing with the semilunar valves. They prevent blood from flowing backward into the systemic circuitry or into the pulmonary circuitry. So we'll see in a bit too some pathologies that are associated with failure and fluid buildup in earlier structures due to heart failure. But first, let's talk a little bit about blood. So the primary function of blood, as I've mentioned, is to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the body's cells and remove wastes from those same cells. Blood serves several really important roles in our body. It transports essential substances like glucose, amino acids to different organs and tissues. Blood also carries away waste like carbon dioxide, nitrogenous wastes to be processed and eliminated from the body. So we'll go over the three main components really briefly here. Plasma is the non-living component of blood, which means that it simply contains water, proteins, nutrients, and hormones. So these are portions that do not perform cellular functions, but they support the overall function of the blood and contain vital components like hormones and proteins for cellular and bodily functions. Oxygen-rich blood is really bright scarlet red, and this is due to the high levels of oxygen that are bound to hemoglobin on our red blood cells. So the hematocrit is this red portion here that consists of red blood cells, also called erythrocytes. And the red color, again, is due to the fact that the element iron is within our blood cells, which is at the core of hemoglobin, and iron provides that red color. So if we spin the blood really fast in a machine called a centrifuge, it separates into these three components. So we see the plasma here is slightly yellow colored. We also see the red blood cells, the erythrocytes that make up the hematocrit, is red colored. And finally, the buffy coat, which is this smaller portion in the middle here, this contains the immune system portion of our blood, immune cells like white blood cells, and it also contains platelets. Who knows or remembers what platelets do? Platelets are part of the blood clotting process. So platelets are really important in forming a blood clot. So I have a little checkpoint here, matching the following terms to their correct definition. If you want to take a moment and pause the video based on what we just talked about. Okay, let's take up this question. So, plasma makes up the liquid portion of our blood, right? Containing water, hormones, proteins. Our red blood cells, their primary role is to transport oxygen with the help of the hemoglobin protein. White blood cells play a role in immunity, so they are important for fighting infections. And finally, platelets are very important in the clotting process. So this is a list of combining forms that are associated with the cardiovascular system. These terms were worked into the specific lecture the slides that we've gone over so far, and we will see them as we move forward. We'll talk more about the coronary arteries, which are the arteries that supply blood to the heart muscle itself. So corono means heart. Cardio is also a combining form for heart. And we've seen these ones as well. So I'm going to pause the video here. When we come back, we're going to talk about common cardiovascular pathologies.